Everyone. We're here for another installment of Authors Unfiltered, Finding Your Niche. I'm Katie Gee Salisbury, and I'm here with Aimee Liu and Ling Brown. And we're here today to talk about, you know, how do you find your audience? How do you define the niche of your writing? As authors, we are always hoping that for the broadest possible audience, we want everyone to read our books. But in reality, it actually really helps to narrow down who your readers really are. And there's a lot of power in niche, especially, we're all Asian American writers, women of color. When you're writing about specific topics, it helps to really define and narrow down your audience. So we're going to talk about that today. And we'll start things off just by introducing ourselves. And I will kick it over to Lauren if you want to help go ahead and talk a little bit about some of your work.
Sure. I'm Ling Brown, and I'm the author of Society of Lies. It's a book about two sisters who get invited to join a secret society at Princeton, and they're born 10 years apart. So when the older sister returns for her younger sister's graduation, she learns that something awful's happened and her little sister has passed away. When she realizes it has to do with that secret society, she starts to investigate for herself. And so that's the mystery that she's unraveling throughout the course of the book. It's my debut novel, and it came out in October of last year.
Great. And are you also writing on Substack, Lauren?
I do write on Substack, but I've paused for the moment to work on my revisions for book 2. So I'm very busy with that right now.
Right.
And what about you, Aimee?
Okay, well, on this topic, I have actually a bunch of books that fall into the category because my very first memoir, Solitaire, was the first memoir of anorexia. So that was a very, very, very narrow niche at the time. And then subsequently, about, what was it, 25, 30 years later, I did Gaining, which was sort of still in that niche of eating disorders, but the niche had grown quite a bit by that point. So that's sort of one corridor, and then the other hat that I wear is writing about Asian American, biracial, in particular, mixed identity. And this was my first novel back in 1994, Face, and nobody had really been writing at all about mixed race identity. I'm especially not Asian American. So that was the first novel. And then my second novel was Cloud Mountain, which continued that theme and was more specifically about my Chinese grandfather and my American grandmother marrying. And a lot of it is the history of the early Republic of China. So that turned out to be very kind of we can talk about it because it was, on the surface, it was very niche. But then the book was kind of embraced by white women's book clubs, which, so it was confusing to me because I tried to market it to Asian American readers and it ended up with very white readers. So we can talk about that.
That sometimes happens. You think you have one audience and you have another one, or you have both of them.
Yeah.
And so I'll just say, my first book, which you can see on the shelf behind me, Not Your China Doll, biography of Anna May Wong, who was first Asian American movie star of the 1920s and 30s. And, much of my writing is about Chinese American or Asian American identity. Not always, but that is kind of my niche so far. Although I've always loved film, which does, that is a lot of what Anna May Wong's story is, right? About the films that she made. And I also write Substack Half Caste Woman, which has been like a companion to the book in many ways, but also explores other Asian Americans who were working in Hollywood, as well as other kind of identity issues and interesting tidbits of history that get forgotten. So that's a bit about my work and my lane. But yeah, I'd love to thank you both for kind of setting up some of your projects and the niches they fall into. I'd love to hear a little bit more about one of the specific books and how you thought about defining the niche, but also thinking about who the readers were, and when you were actually out, trying to connect with readers, like how did that hurt or help that process? Like how did it help you? Like how did defining the audience help you connect with your actual readers? So, Lauren, maybe you can
Okay,
take that one
sure.
first.
Sure, I'll go first. I guess for me, while I'm writing, I'm trying to picture my readers as just women in general, especially probably women from 20 to 60. Just, I don't know. I guess that's women in general. Um, but I tend to end up writing about mixed identity women in my stories because that's just who I am. And so I bring a lot of my own life and my own life experience into my writing. Because what I'm really searching for is the truth behind these characters' stories, and to try to talk about subjects that are just maybe taboo or just a little bit more difficult to talk about. Um, with our friends and family. And so I do think of my readership as women in general, and I try not to think of it actually as too niche, but it ends up becoming niche just because of who I am, I think. And I've connected with readers, both women who are white women and women of color who really identify with the characters in my books. And it means a lot to me when it inspires them to write themselves or just to see someone who reminds them of themselves in the characters.
I love that. I think that's such a great way to think about it, that your own perspective is the niche that you are, maybe you're giving that perspective to other people by writing.
Mhm. Yeah. That's how I think of it. How about
Um,
you?
well, when I started writing the memoir about anorexia, and to a great degree gaining too, I thought I was writing very specifically with that audience in mind. Um, Both people who had eating disorders and their families. Partly because at the time that I wrote the first book, way back in 1979, there had never been another memoir about it. So I nobody had told their stories. Everybody was living in hiding and shame and thinking they were the only one. And so I really wanted to expand their awareness that they weren't alone. And I think that's kind of always in the background of why I write is you're not alone. I'm trying to reach readers who think that was certainly when I wrote Face. It was the same thing. Looked around and thought, I know there are a lot more biracial Chinese Americans than we ever see in literature. And I've never heard people have a conversation about it. And I've never heard people talk about sort of the flip side of in that book. My character is she's half white, but she's living in Chinatown. So I wanted to turn things around from the usual. Um, so I think for me, when I write these books, they are niche, and I am thinking that they will have to find their way to the ideal audience. So sometimes it's the the situation or the moment makes that kind of easy. And sometimes it's good to be the first out of the gate with an idea like that. So when Solitaire came out, the memoir of anorexia, I got onto Today's Show very easily. Organizations for mental health treatment organizations had me come and speak. I did a very robust book tour, and a lot of people, families who were dealing with this, gravitated to the book because there was so little out there about it that helped them. Um, and to a lesser degree, that was true when Gaining came out in 2007. There was many more treatment facilities at that time. There were many more organizations, so I had a lot more places to go and speak. I will say that in something like that, and perhaps there's some of this that I also encountered with the Asian American books. you've got to kind of be aware of the the role that shame can play in particularly when you're promoting a book like this, because I could not really go into a bookstore and have a book event for the books about eating disorders because nobody would show up. There was too much shame around it, so people wouldn't come to public places and show an interest in the book, but they would come en masse to safe spaces like, there was the Women's Center at Yale University. People drove for 2.5 hours to get to the night that we talked about, the book there. So there are funny things about niche audiences that you really have to think about, especially maybe not so much when you're writing the book, but when you're promoting the book, you have to think about your readers and where they are and how you can best reach them in ways that are going to be comfortable and easy for them. Um, when I was trying to promote Cloud Mountain, that was 1997, I wanted to reach Asian American audiences, but Asian American readers they were either reading books in Chinese or they just hadn't connected with the body of American literature. It was after the Joy Luck Club, but the Joy Luck Club had hit white American readers much more than it hit Chinese American readers. And I fell into that same gap. I really wanted to connect with Chinese American readers, but I couldn't find them.
Mm.
I couldn't reach them. And my publisher didn't know anything about reaching them. So we ended up going to, sort of very white women's book group kind of audiences. And because it was a family saga with the main female character is an American woman, they could connect with that. But I couldn't get to any readers who would identify with my grandfather,
Hmm.
who is the
Yeah.
Chinese American character.
No,
And that was
that
sad.
that's really fascinating because I mean, it shows you how much things have changed. I mean, well, I guess it's 20 plus years, but I think the internet has made it so much easier to find people, right? To find interest groups, communities where they are. I know with my book, Anime Wong is, an icon, a Hollywood icon, but lesser known today. I mean, she was internationally famous during her lifetime, but a lot of people have never heard of her before, especially outside of the Asian American community. And it's interesting, I think, picking up on themes of things that both of you have said. There's this idea of the reader you're writing for, and then the reader who actually reads the book out in the world, right? Or you connect with at events. And I know when I was writing this book about Anime Wong, I was definitely the reader I had in mind was someone like me. I was thinking of an Asian American woman. I wanted to tell her story in a way that reflected my own experiences, my mother and grandmother and friends' experiences being Chinese American, things that I hadn't seen reflected in other books that had been written about her. So that was definitely the way I was thinking about how I wrote it. But then, after writing it and then thinking about, okay, now how do I actually get this book into people's hands and who would be interested in this? Of course, there's the Asian American community. I mean, my biggest supporters have definitely been Chinese American community centers, museums, institutions all over the country. And there's so many of them. So that has been really incredible to be able to do events with these different groups. But of course, there's also the Hollywood element to it, the cinematic part, and finding film buffs. And so one of the things that I have done, and I was very lucky that I had some people who had connections to theaters in the very beginning, but I've done a lot of film screenings because that has been a really great way not only to introduce people to Anime Wong in her films, because so many people have heard of her but never actually watched one of her films, but also to really break into the film crowd, which is a very different audience. And as I've learned, which I've been interested in too, because I go to a lot of screenings now, like at MoMA in New York, and I'm always like surprised that it's such a white male audience. Film buffs just tend to be guys, and so it's really interesting to see the different types of events that you can have around one book, where maybe one audience will be very Asian American, one might be more, film people, and then sometimes I have more general audience people who are just a mix of everyone, people who are interested in history, people who are interested in historical female figures, things like that. So it's been interesting. Oh, yeah, and then I should also mention, of course, there are the Anime Wong fans, the diehard fans, which, actually tend to be a lot of older white men. Not super
Really?
surprising, yes. So there's
Oh,
that audience of people too, and so, I mean, her fans tend to be younger Asian American women and older men, because, I think they remember her, right? They
Mhm,
probably saw her movies being played on television when they were kids.
mhm.
And so she's definitely like lodged in their consciousness of pop culture. Yeah, so it's been really fascinating to, just figure out um, how this book connects with different people in different ways. Um, so the other question that I had for everyone is, have you found that there have been advantages or disadvantages to being in specific having your books written in specific niches? And I know we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'd love to hear some specific examples if you have any.
Hmm. Do you wanna go first?
sure. I have actually a great example of being
Okay,
too
good.
niche. After Gaining came out, I received hundreds and hundreds of letters from people who were recovering from eating disorders, and the gist of that book was I wrote everything that I knew in 2007 that I hadn't known in 1975 when or 79 when the first book came out. And in particular, what had come through in the science was the genetic link to eating disorders. A very, very, very strong genetic link, which kind of helped to let mothers off the hook a bit. They had been blamed for eating disorders for decades, and the genetic link kind of leveled the playing field a little bit. And people were kind of blown away by that. So I got lots and lots and lots of letters from people who were kind of trying to make sense of these different puzzle pieces and told me their stories. And I thought, this is really great. And I had made lots of good friends in the Academy for Eating Disorders, which is the big scientific organization that that is made up of therapists and scientists who are working on eating disorders, and we teamed up. And so I selected some of the most compelling letters that I'd received and put them into an order to kind of trace the arc of recovery from eating disorders. And for each one, I had a member of the Academy write, more of a research-based introduction to the letter. So it was a really terrific kind of a handbook to recovery, kind of. And I was doing it hand in hand with all of these people who had written letters and all of these members of the Academy. And the Academy let me come to the conference, and we did a big launch for the book. And I thought, okay, I'm not intending this to be a bestseller, but I certainly thought it would sell a few thousand copies off of all of these people who had, I thought, vested interests in the book. And it didn't at all. I mean, it just sort of tanked after that. And it was a small press that published it, so there was no, publicity budget or anything like that. So I'd done quite a lot of work. Actually, a lot of people had done a lot of work on this book, and thinking that this particular niche audience would be so strong and motivated to, help it launch. I had visions of it being in the waiting room of each of the people who had contributed to the book. I had visions of the people who'd written letters, sharing it with their friends who were struggling. None of that happened. I don't know why to this day, but I had just, I had done the whole book banking on this what I thought was going to be a very strong niche audience, and it just didn't work at all. So that's my sad story on that.
I think for Society of Lies, the sisters, just being who they are, half Black and half Chinese, multiracial like I am, it becomes niche because there just aren't that many books about multiracial women characters. But then what I tried to do was combine that with a thriller type of plot that was pretty familiar. So, at an institution, at a university, and a secret society, and the charismatic professor, that's been done before many times. And so it was my spin on it by combining what was niche with what was mainstream. And that's what I tried to do to find my audience, I guess.
That's so smart to take take the unfamiliar element and pair it
Mhm.
with the familiar. I like the way you think about that. Um, so for me, I mean, thinking about advantages and disadvantages to having written a book that fits in a couple different niches, it's certainly difficult sometimes to be writing about an Asian American figure because there's just not as much publicity space
Mhm.
for Asian Americans. And in my case, one of the disadvantages was there was actually another book, another biography that had been written about Anna May Wong, and a fictionalized version of her story that came out about 9 months before mine. And unfortunately, those books got the press for Anna May Wong. So by the time my book came out, people in the media that we were pitching were like, "Well, we've already heard this story. Sorry, like we're not going to cover Anna May Wong again. Like maybe in 5 years." I mean, they didn't say that, but that's me reading between the lines. It was like, "Oh,
Mhm.
sorry, been there, done that." Meanwhile, like if I had written a book about Marilyn Monroe, people will print stuff about Marilyn Monroe all day long, every day.
Mhm.
So there's a little bit of a difference in terms of what society is interested or thinks that people are interested in. But the flip side is that there are a lot of great Asian American venues, communities, publications. Um, Personalities. There are a lot of people who care about Anime Wong, and because of the internet, I can now find them, right?
Mhm.
So it takes a little bit of extra legwork, but it is possible to find those people now. And maybe you would have been able to do that, Amy, back in the day, had more of those communities existed online at the time. The other thing, because we were talking about this before we went live, was this idea of being the first to a niche, right? To write on a specific topic that just hasn't been discussed widely. And that was something that I also experienced to an extent when we were pitching the idea for this book. So basically one of the editors, so when you go into pitch meetings at publishers, they're going to ask you what are the comp titles, what are the other titles out there that are like your book. And so this editor said, well, we couldn't find any comp titles for your book because there aren't any biographies of Asian American women. They
Mm.
don't exist.
Wow.
Which is, like, so shocking, and Dev is like, "What do you mean they don't exist?" I mean, they must exist, but not on a level that they were interested in, and so the comps that they came up with was a biography of the Dowager Empress of, the Qing dynasty, and I was like, "Well, that's not really a good comparison."
Yeah.
I think that might be a different niche, different audience. But yeah, there is definitely, I think, um, a challenge to being the first to something or even like the fifth person to something.
Mhm.
But I really loved your approach, Lauren, of like thinking about, well, I want to write about mixed race characters. How can I do it in a way that's accessible and approachable?
Mhm.
Right.
Mhm.
And that makes a lot of sense. Um, so here's a question for people who are tuning in, and also people tuning in. If you have questions for us, feel free to put them in the chat. But what would you tell aspiring writers
Mm.
about how to think about or how to define the topics that they're interested in writing? And like, do writers need to pick a lane, or is it okay to dabble in different niches per se?
I would say pick a genre. So what you like to read the most and what you're most familiar with, because I think that the voice and the tropes and the format of that genre will come more naturally, especially if it's the first novel you're writing. And then what I like to do is within that genre, I'll create pitches like the back cover copy of a book, and I'll make 25 of them, 50, and now I just keep adding more and more as I think of ideas, and so I'll have a folder with, like, 100 different ideas, and if I don't know what I wanna write, I'll scroll through them and just highlight the ones that I like the best and then pitch my family and friends and see which ones I feel like I can write, and also which ones kind of resonate with them.
Wow, that's such a structured way of doing it. I like that.
Well, I would say kind of the same thing. I was thinking, if you can find the balanced, broad context, and it that's a genre that's I mean, that's basically what I did with Cloud Mountain too. The family saga is a big genre that appeals to lots and lots of people, and within that genre, the niche focus on a couple that you know met and married in 1906. When it was against the law for Chinese to marry Americans, gave it the particularity, but the sweeping saga of, from 1906 to 1940, from the San Francisco earthquake to World War II, that kind of thing, has a huge viewership, and I kind of did the same thing. My last novel was Glorious Boy, which is also very, very, very niche in that it's about a part of the world that nobody in our world has ever heard of, which is the Andaman Islands, which used to be part of British India off the coast of Burma. And I was fascinated by this very, very exotic place, but I didn't know how I was going to make anybody else interested in it. And then it turned out that it was a pivotal location during World War II. So I ended up writing another kind of family saga set in World War II. So my hope with that was that it would appeal to, not just sort of armchair travelers who wanted to go to a really exotic location, but also, people who are really looking for a different angle on World War II. So I think that combination of the universal and the specific, finding the universal context for your niche and making sure that you kind of balance both is really important. And I also think that a different way of kind of flipping that around is finding the novelty within the niche that has universal interest to everybody. So, for example, going back to Solitaire, it was the first memoir of anorexia. So, even though my intended audience was people who, actually were struggling with anorexia and had never seen a memoir about it before, seen their story, it also, I think, attracted a lot of people who said, "What is this? This is weird." Because it was new. And so I think that sometimes that can work for you too.
Yeah, definitely like the novelty of something and breaking it open for other people for the
Mhm.
first time. Um, I think that it is good advice to most writers to start in a specific genre, or to start with this. I mean, it helps people understand like who you are as a writer and how
Mhm,
to think about your work. And it's one of those things too that I don't know that any of us really can go into writing defining like what kind of writer we're going to be. It's like something you figure out on the page,
mhm,
right? You don't really know what you're interested in until you start writing about it, which is what I mean, I didn't set out to be like, "Oh, I'm only gonna write about Asian American things." It just happened that those were the things that I was interested in and about also about my multiracial identity.
mhm,
And, now that I feel like before I wrote my book on Anime Wong, I was also doing a photojournalism project about Chinese restaurant workers in New York. And so I did that project and then I moved on to Anime Wong. And so I felt like I've spent a lot of time writing things about Chinese American identity in different ways, whether it was more journalistic reporting or a biography or personal essays. And so now at this point in my, I'm still early in my writing career, only have one book under my belt. But the next book that I'm working on is again nonfiction, but about multiracial identity in America. It's kind of a cultural history, exploring this topic because interestingly enough, you know, there are multiracial characters in fiction, and there are a lot of memoirs written by multiracial people about their specific experiences, but there aren't really, outside of like parenting books or academic books, there really aren't.
Academic books, yeah.
Yeah, there really aren't popular books about what it means to be mixed, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
I think personal narratives are very important, and you can always find something to relate to in them, but it's not quite the same thing as writing about maybe like the broad structural experience of being mixed, which is different for every single person. Anyways, this is a long way of me saying that I feel like I'm kind of shifting niches or genres. I mean, in many ways, the book about Aimee Wong is about race. It's also about gender. It's about Hollywood. I mean, it's about a lot of things, but race is definitely a big dynamic of it. So I'm kind of like maybe shifting sideways to a slightly different perspective and point of view, and kind of breaking outside of the Asian American bubble that I've been in, or maybe going into, I don't know, I can't tell if I'm going into a smaller or a bigger bubble.
It's a bigger bubble, I would
I
say.
think it's a
I
bigger
think
bubble, but
it's a
we'll
bigger bubble, but it's less defined.
yes.
So, which could be good or could be bad. I mean, it's tricky.
Right,
But
right. It's almost less
yeah,
of a niche, right?
yeah,
Because there's people who are multiracial, right? But there's also interracial couples, which is related but different.
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
there's also, when Cloud Mountain came out, here, like even in California, but certainly in the mainland of America, everybody thought it was quite novel to write a book about a Chinese man and American woman. But I remember being in the bookstore at USC, and these two young women, students from Hawaii, came by. I said, "What's the big deal? Who cares?" Like, it was like that was a story that they had grown up listening to. They had no interest in a book about it at all. So, you know,
Yeah, well, but that just goes back to this idea that you really do have to define your audience, because
yeah.
um, people are in different places and have different perspectives on things. Um,
Yeah.
so, anyone in the audience, we're happy to ask questions about finding your niche as a writer, or we can also just keep chatting.
Katie, I wanted to ask you a question back to the fact that you had all of these other books that were coming out kind of right before you. And I have been so incredibly impressed by how you have marketed your book, and just you seem to be everywhere all at once doing events constantly. I mean, that's just been so impressive. And I think part of it is that your book is very different because, one of the niches that genre itself can be a niche. So a typical biography is a kind of a niche in itself, but your book breaks out of that because your book is kind of stylistically a hybrid between a biography and a novel. And I wonder if you could talk about your process of kind of creating this form and inhabiting Aimee Wong and the characters of her life so fully and so confidently, bringing them alive on the page without completely going over to fiction. I mean, how did you do that? And did you have the audience in mind, the audience for a book like that in mind when you were writing
Hmm.
it? Or did you just think you were writing to a typical biography reader?
No, thank you for the question. That's a great question. And before I answer, I'm just going to say hi to my Uncle John, who's watching from Grants Pass, Oregon. Hi, Uncle John. Thank you for tuning in. Um, yeah, no, I'm glad you asked that question because it was really intentional the way that I wrote the book. I had a lot of time to think about this because in my other life, I was working as a book editor at HarperCollins and then at Amazon. And I worked on a lot of narrative nonfiction, which tends to be deeply researched and historical, right? I mean, it's kind of, it combines the best of, when it's done really well, it combines the best of fiction and research that goes into anything
Mhm.
nonfiction. So and part of it was also, having read the other biographies of Anna May Wong, they're all written. I think I'm right in saying that all the other biographies are written by academics. And even though they were positioned for a popular audience, they are written from an academic perspective. They're a bit drier. They're not quite as a dynamic as Anna May Wong herself was, and that was something I was always craving and missing from those books. Even as I was, hungry to learn more about her, I just felt like, well, something is missing. Like I wanted to be there with her and experience these moments. So it was very intentional to take a narrative nonfiction style of writing and apply it to Anna May Wong's life. And, this will just show you my naivete is that when I started out writing this book, to me, I was just writing a book about Anna May Wong. And then people would say, so is it a biography? And I was like, well, I guess, I guess so. I guess it is a biography. So it took me a while to figure out, oh, I'm writing a biography. But I did really take, the research aspect of it very seriously. It was almost, it's kind of a, psychological burden because you really want to get things right, but this person has been dead for more than 60 years and you've never met them. So I did the best that I could by trying to collect as much information as possible and then wrote it in a way that stayed true to the facts. With some small liberties, which I think even in a typical biography, you have to take, right? You have to interpret the evidence. No one's going to really tell you what exactly happened. But yeah, I wanted it to have this, the sleight of hand of, there's no real narrator. It's just you experiencing her life
Mhm.
with her.
Mhm.
So yeah, so thank you for that question. It was, yeah, I mean, part of me was like, can I do this? And like, will people think that this is like, not legitimate for a biography? I don't know.
I think it really helped break it out of the biography niche and probably, really made a big difference. I have another question also for Lauren, which on the same thing, which is your book was a Reese's book club pick, and I assume that you've been to a lot of book clubs and talked to a
Mhm.
lot of readers. And how much of the niche part of the story do they bring up, or do they just kind of pass over it and see themselves in the book, or see
Mm.
characters like them in the book regardless? I mean, did
Ac
did the niche play in a lot
Yeah,
or not?
they did. They definitely talked about being multiracial and how their experiences of college were similar or different than mine. And we talked about our hair, we talked about, like, fitting into one group, sometimes in another group another time, or none at all. And so I think that was a really rewarding kind of conversation that I had with many book clubs.
Oh, that's great.
Mhm.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, we're almost to the 40-minute mark. So I think unless there are any other questions from the audience or Lauren, if you have any questions.
I
Oh,
have
you
one
have one?
thing that
Mhm.
I just wanted to add what I was telling you before we started, which is sometimes the historical moment makes it a niche and then things change after that. So we were talking about a colleague of mine who had a book. It was a memoir, one of the first lesbian memoirs. It was published in 1999, but it was about, kind of coming out in the 1970s. And it was published by Houghton Mifflin, so it was a big publisher, but they didn't know what to do with it because the niche was so unformed in 1999
Mhm.
that the book kind of, fumbled around. And then, of course, gay literature exploded after that, and there became, lots of different tracks for publishing books in the gay world, LGBTQ world. And so the publisher, a different publisher came back and offered to republish the book in 2015. And so in 2015, it came out to a much bigger, sort of more welcoming, more established reception than it had had early on. So sometimes if you're writing in a niche that's too early or too small, you should keep your eye on the zeitgeist, because the moment may come around again when that very, very niche book has a bigger audience and you have another opportunity. So.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's a really great point. I mean, when I was still working in-house as an editor, one thing we would always say is a book is forever. So even if you don't initially find your audience when the book comes out, it's out there. It's in libraries. It's there for someone to find it when the time is right. And I mean, of course, sometimes that's a way of making ourselves feel better when we feel like our book hasn't found its audience. But I used to always think about, there was this story about when Barack Obama wrote his memoir. I don't know if maybe he was a senator then, but he wasn't famous on a national level yet. It was before his, famous DNC speech. And I read this article about how he went on book tour, and it was like most people's book tours. You show up at a bookstore, which is, publishers so rarely even send you to bookstores in other
Mm-hmm.
cities anymore. So he shows up to a bookstore in some city he's not from, and there's just like a handful of people who've shown up. So instead of having them sit in the audience, they just moved the chairs to be a circle so they could just have like a discussion. And I thought that was like so charming. But it was always just like this reminder that, well, this person who wrote a book and 5 people showed up to his event then became the president of the United States. And so the perspective on his book changed a little bit, right? The demand for it changed. So there is that for all of us to think about too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just to circle back to something that you spoke about briefly earlier, I feel like on the internet now, like social media, on Instagram, there are such niche communities that one person who can identify with your character can make a huge difference, reaching all of her friends and all of her family and other communities that she's in just by posting about your book. So I think for me, the way to get the word out there, or the way that I got the word out there, and it wasn't really my doing, it was these book bloggers who had a major influence on the reach of the book, I think.
Mm.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Did they highlight the multiracial aspect of it?
Yeah, definitely. And they
Oh, great.
still are doing that actually now, like almost a year later.
Yeah. And I think,
Congratulations. It's
yeah,
great.
that's so fantastic. And I think that just goes back again to the power of niche, right? Because
Hmm.
when someone can see themselves in your work because it is really targeted, or is coming from that perspective that is typically perceived as niche, it
Hmm.
means something to them, right?
Hmm.
They connect with it on a deep level, which is
Right.
why they would go out and tell everyone they know, you have to read this,
Right.
right? So there is really power in that. And I hope we've maybe shed some light on the topic for people today. But thank you, Aimee and Lauren, for being here and being a part of Authors Unfiltered. And I guess we'll call it a day for now and until next time.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
It's
Great to
very
see you
fun.
both.
You too.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.